What if your night job was hiding something truly unsettling? I took on a cleaning shift at a Texas pub, thinking it would be routine, but I soon realized the place had a life and a past of its own. Prepare to be unnerved as we pulled back the curtain on the bizarre rules and strange occurrences that haunted my every move. The rusty Spur pub sat at the edge of Lockhart like a rotting tooth, its weathered facade barely visible beneath the sprawling oak that cast twisted shadows across the gravel parking lot. I pulled up at 11:30 p.m., my headlights cutting through the thick August darkness, and killed the engine. The silence that followed felt wrong somehow, too complete for a place that sat just off Highway 183. No distant traffic hum, no cricket song, nothing but the tick of my cooling engine and the hammering of my own pulse. I needed this job. After 3 months of unemployment and a landlord who'd stopped accepting excuses, I wasn't in a position to be choosy. When Raymond Kowalski, the pub's owner, had offered me $200 cash for 5 hours of deep cleaning, 3 nights a week, I jumped at it. He'd been oddly specific during our brief phone interview. Night shift only, no questions about the building's quirks, and absolute adherence to a list of rules he'd provide. I'd chalked it up to the eccentricity of a small-town business owner. Standing in that parking lot, surrounded by darkness that seemed to press against my skin, I was beginning to reconsider. The pub itself was a squat brick building that had probably been charming once, maybe 50 years ago. Now it looked tired, sagging, the neon sign in the window buzzing erratically even though it was supposed to be off. The previous owner had died here, Raymond had mentioned casually, like he was commenting on the weather. Heart attack, right behind the bar. Natural causes, nothing to worry about. But the way he'd said it, too quickly, too dismissively, made me wonder what he wasn't saying. I grabbed my cleaning supplies from the trunk and approached the entrance. The key Raymond had given me was old, the kind with an ornate head that suggested the lock predated modern security systems. It turned with a grinding resistance, and the door swung inward on hinges that shrieked like a wounded animal. The smell hit me immediately. Stale beer and cigarette smoke, expected, but underneath there was something else, something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in a warm room, or flowers decaying in stagnant water. The interior was darker than it should have been. Raymond had assured me all the lights worked, but the overhead fixtures cast a sickly yellow glow that seemed to be absorbed by the walls rather than illuminating them. The main room stretched before me, bar along the right side, scattered tables and chairs creating a maze of shadows, and in the back corner, a jukebox that was already playing. That stopped me cold. The jukebox was on, filling the empty pub with a crackling rendition of Patsy Cline's Crazy. But I was supposed to be alone. I was definitely alone. Raymond had given me the only key. My hands trembled as I set down my supplies and pulled out the envelope he'd left for me, taped to the bar top with my name scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. Inside was my advance payment and a single sheet of paper, the rules he'd mentioned. I held it under the weak light and began to read. Rules for night cleaning at the Rusty Spur. 1. Never turn off the jukebox. Ever. If it stops on its own, leave immediately. 2. Do not look directly at the mirror behind the bar between midnight and 3 a.m. 3. If you hear footsteps upstairs, ignore them. The second floor has been sealed for 20 years. 4. The cold storage door must remain locked. Do not open it, even if you hear knocking. 5. If the telephone rings, do not answer. It hasn't been connected to a line since 1987. 6. Clean only the main room and restrooms. Do not enter the kitchen after midnight. 7. If you see a woman in a blue dress sitting at table 7, continue working as normal. Do not speak to her or acknowledge her presence. 8. Keep all curtains and blinds closed. 9. If the lights go out, count to 30 before using your flashlight. 10. Leave before 5 a.m. Do not stay to watch the sunrise from inside. My mouth had gone dry by the time I finished reading. These weren't rules. They were warnings. Each one was specific, deliberate, like they'd been written in response to something that had actually happened. The casual mention of a woman in a blue dress, the disconnected telephone that might ring anyway, the sealed second floor where footsteps still walked. These weren't precautions. They were admissions. I should have left. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drop the list, walk out that door, and never look back. But I thought about my eviction notice, about the $43 in my checking account, about the way Raymond's envelope felt heavy with cash in my pocket. I thought about how I'd explain to my sister why I couldn't make rent again, why I'd bailed on another opportunity. Pride, stubbornness, or maybe just bone-deep desperation made the decision for me. I folded the list, tucked it into my pocket, and picked up my cleaning supplies. The jukebox clicked and whirred, transitioning from Patsy Cline to Hank Williams. At least the music was normal, classic country that any Texas bar might play. I focused on that, on the familiar, as I started with the tables closest to the door. My plan was simple. Work fast, work efficiently, follow the rules to the letter, collect my money, and reevaluate in the light of day whether this job was worth continuing. The first hour passed without incident. If you could ignore the persistent feeling of being watched. I kept my back to the bar mirror, remembering Rule 2, and wiped down tables with mechanical precision. The wood was sticky with decades of spilled drinks, the chairs scuffed and wobbly. Normal wear and tear. Nothing supernatural about grime. But then I heard it, the distinct sound of glass clinking against glass, coming from the bar area behind me. I froze, rag in hand, and listened. There was again the unmistakable sound of bottles being moved, rearranged like someone was taking inventory of the liquor shelf. The jukebox was still playing, now working through a Johnny Cash song, but underneath that familiar melody, the clinking continued. I turned slowly, breaking my self-imposed rule about keeping my back to the bar. The bottles stood in their neat rows, completely still. No breeze disturbed them. No vibration from passing traffic could account for the sound. Yet as I watched, one bottle, a half-empty fifth of whiskey, rocked gently on its base, as if someone had just set it down after pouring a drink. My heart was trying to crawl in my throat. I glanced at my phone, 12:47 a.m., deep in the window of time when I wasn't supposed to look at the mirror. But the mirror was right there, behind the bar, and in my peripheral vision, I could swear I saw movement in its reflection. A shape, human-sized, standing exactly where I stood, but different somehow. Wrong somehow. I forced myself to turn away, to focus on the tables, to keep cleaning. Just follow the rules. That's all I had to do. Follow the rules and collect my money and get out at 5 a.m. Simple. Except nothing about the Rusty Spur was simple. As I moved to the next cluster of tables, I felt it. A cold spot so intense it was like walking into a freezer. The temperature drop was localized, affecting only a small area near table 7, the table mentioned in the rules. I looked at it, really looked at it, and for just a moment, I could have sworn the chair was pulled out slightly, as if someone had just stood up from it. The jukebox cycled to another song. The bottle stayed still. The cold spot dissipated as suddenly as it had appeared. And I kept cleaning, because what else could I do? I was trapped by my own need, by $200 cash and 5 hours of night that stretched ahead of me like a gauntlet. I had no choice but to run. By 2 a.m., I'd finished the tables and moved on to sweeping. The broom's bristles scratched against the old wooden floor, a rhythm that was almost meditative. I let myself fall into it. Let the repetitive motion calm my racing thoughts. Maybe this was manageable. Maybe the rules were just superstition, old stories that had calcified into ritual. Maybe I could do this. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came from directly above me, slow and deliberate, the creak of weight on old floorboards. Back and forth like someone pacing, like someone waiting. I remembered Rule 3 with crystalline clarity. If you hear footsteps upstairs, ignore them. The second floor has been sealed for 20 years. The broom handle slipped in my sweating palms. 20 years sealed, but something was still walking up there. The footsteps continued, methodical and patient, and I forced myself to keep sweeping, to follow the rules, to not think about what could still be moving in a space that had been locked and forgotten for 2 decades. This was going to be a very long night. The footsteps eventually stopped, but they left something behind, a tension in the air that made every sound feel amplified, every shadow feel occupied. I'd moved on to mopping the floor, working my way from the entrance toward the back of the pub, when the first whisper reached me. It was so faint I almost missed it beneath the jukebox's steady stream of country ballads. Just a breath of sound, like someone speaking from the next room, words indistinct but intention clear. Someone was trying to communicate. I stopped mopping and listened, straining to pick out actual words from what might have just been the building settling or wind through unseen cracks. There was again a low murmur, almost conversational, coming from the direction of the restrooms. I checked my phone, 2:34 a.m., and consulted the rules again. Nothing about voices, nothing about whispers. Did that mean they were safe to investigate, or that they were so common they didn't warrant mentioning? The mop bucket's wheels squeaked as I pushed it toward the hallway that led to the restrooms. The sound of my own movement felt intrusive, too loud, like I was announcing myself to whatever was waiting in the darkness ahead. The hallway was narrow, walls pressing close, with the men's room on the left and the women's on the right. The whispering seemed to be coming from neither and both, surrounding me, a conversation I couldn't quite hear, but knew was about me. I checked the men's room first, pushing the door open with my foot and reaching for the light switch. The fluorescent tubes flickered twice before catching, flooding the small space with harsh white light. 3 urinals, 2 stalls, a sink with a cracked mirror above it. Empty. Normal. I clean it quickly, efficiently, trying to ignore how the water from my mop bucket seemed to run dark, like I was washing away something more than just dirt. The women's room was the same. Empty, ordinary, except for the cold. It was colder in here than it had been anywhere else in the pub. Cold enough that I could see my breath misting in the air. I worked fast, wanting out of that freezing space, and I was almost finished when I noticed the writing on the back of the stall door. It was carved into the paint, deep gouges that had been there a while. She's still here. Below it, in different handwriting, like a response, I know. I see her too. And below that, most recent, the wood still pale where it had been scratched, table 7. Every night, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I backed out of the stall, out of the restroom, and nearly collided with my mop bucket in my haste to get back to the main room. The woman in the blue dress. Table 7. Multiple people had seen her, enough to leave messages, warnings, confirmations. She wasn't just a story or a superstition. She was recurring, regular, expected. I forced myself to return to the main room, to resume mopping, but I couldn't stop glancing at table 7. It sat in the back corner, partially obscured by shadows that the overhead lights couldn't quite penetrate. The chair I'd noticed earlier was definitely pulled out now, angled as if someone had just vacated it. And on the table surface, I could see something I'd missed before, a ring of condensation, perfectly circular, as if a cold glass had been sitting there recently. The jukebox clicked over to a new song, something I didn't recognize, slower and more melancholic than the previous selections. And in the momentary silence between tracks, I heard it clearly. Laughter, faint, feminine, tinged with something that wasn't quite joy. It came from the direction of table 7, and when I looked, really looked, despite every instinct telling me not to, I saw her. Just for a second. A flicker of blue fabric, pale skin, dark hair pinned up in a style from another era. She was there, and then she wasn't, like a photograph superimposed on reality and just as quickly removed. But in that brief glimpse, I saw her face. She was smiling, But it was the wrong kind of smile, empty and automatic, like a reflex performed long after the emotion behind it had died. Rule 7 echoed in my mind. If you see a woman in a blue dress sitting at table 7, continue working as normal. Do not speak to her or acknowledge her presence. I understood now. This wasn't about being polite or respecting the dead. This was about survival. Acknowledgement might be invitation. Engagement might be fatal. I turned back to my mopping with rigid determination, keeping my eyes on the floor, on the bucket, on anything but table 7. The laughter had stopped, but the cold spot had returned, and it was moving. I could feel it approaching, a pocket of frigid air that drifted across the room like it had purpose, like it was searching. It passed within inches of me, and the temperature drop was so severe that my teeth chattered involuntarily. Then it was gone, and the pub returned to its baseline state of wrong. Just the music, the dim lights, the smell of old beer, and that other thing, that decay smell that seemed to be getting stronger as the night wore on. By 3 a.m., I'd finished the main room and was preparing to tackle the bar itself. This was going to be tricky. The rules said don't look at the mirror between midnight and 3, but it was 3 now, which meant I should be safe. Should be. I approached the bar cautiously, cleaning supplies in hand, and risked a glance at the mirror. My reflection looked back at me, haggard and frightened, which was accurate enough. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite identify. The angle was wrong, maybe, or the lighting, or no. It was the background. In the mirror, I could see the main room behind me, the tables and chairs and the jukebox in the corner. But I could also see people. They were faint, translucent, like images projected on smoke. But they were there, a crowd of them, sitting at tables, standing at the bar, moving through the space like it was any other night. A woman in a blue dress sat at table 7. Of course she did. But she was clearer in the reflection than she'd been in reality, solid and defined. She was looking directly at me, or rather, at my reflection, and her smile had teeth now. Too many teeth, sharp and predatory. I jerked my gaze away from the mirror and focused on cleaning the bar top with shaking hands. 3 a.m. had arrived, which meant I could look at the mirror safely, but what I'd seen suggested that safely was a relative term. The mirror wasn't just showing me my reflection. It was showing me the pub's other occupants, the ones who didn't leave when the sun came up, who'd never leave at all. As I worked my way along the bar, scrubbing at stains that had probably been there since before I was born, the cash register suddenly sprang to life. The drawer shot open with a sharp ding, and the receipt printer began chattering, spitting out paper in a long, continuous stream. I watched, paralyzed, as the receipt grew longer and longer, curling onto the floor in a pale ribbon. When it finally stopped, I picked up the end and began reading. It wasn't a receipt. It was a list of names, dozens of them, printed in the faint, mechanical letters of the register's tape. Next to each name was a date. Some were recent, within the last few years. Others went back decades. And at the bottom, freshly printed, was a name that made my blood turn to ice. My own name, followed by today's date. Was this a prediction? A threat? Or just a record of everyone who'd worked here? Everyone who'd spent a night alone with whatever haunted the rusty spur? I stuffed the receipt into my pocket with the rules, evidence I probably shouldn't keep, but couldn't bring myself to leave behind. The telephone rang. The sound was shrill and anachronistic, the mechanical jangle of a rotary phone cutting through the jukebox's music. It sat at the far end of the bar, an ancient beige model with a coiled cord and a dial face yellowed with age. It rang and rang, insistent, demanding, and I remembered Rule 5 with perfect clarity. If the telephone rings, do not answer. It hasn't been connected to a line since 1987. I kept cleaning, kept scrubbing, kept my hands busy, and my eyes averted from that ringing phone. But whoever, whatever, was calling was persistent. The ringing continued for a full minute, then 2, the sound drilling into my skull until I want to scream. Just make it stop. Just pick it up and make it stop. But I didn't. I followed the rules. And eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the ringing ceased. The silence that followed was worse somehow, heavy with the implication that whoever had been calling would try again later, would keep trying until they got an answer. I checked my phone. 3:47 a.m. A little over an hour until I could leave. I could survive an hour. I just had to keep working, keep following the rules, keep my mind focused on the mundane tasks of cleaning rather than the impossible things happening around me. That's when I heard the knocking. It came from the back of the pub, from the direction of what Raymond had called the cold storage. The door was metal, industrial grade, with a heavy deadbolt that looked newer than anything else in the building. And something behind it was knocking, a slow, deliberate rhythm that sounded distinctly like knuckles on metal. Knock, 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 pause, knock, knock, knock. Rule 4. The cold storage door must remain locked. Do not open it, even if you hear knocking. The knocking continued, patient and methodical, like whoever was trapped inside knew they had all the time in the world. Like they'd been knocking for years and would knock for years more, waiting for someone foolish enough or desperate enough to let them out. I stayed at the bar, as far from that door as I could get while still remaining in the main room. The knocking eventually stopped, but the memory of it lingered, raising questions I desperately didn't want answered. What was in that cold storage? Why was it locked from the outside? And what would happen if someone ever opened it? The jukebox fell silent. My heart stopped with it. The sudden absence of music was deafening, made every other sound too loud, too present. I fumbled for the rules, reading them again by the light of my phone. Never turn off the jukebox. Ever. If it stops on its own, leave immediately. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my cleaning supplies, stuffed them haphazardly into my bag, and headed for the door. To hell with finishing the shift. To hell with the money. Some things weren't worth the price, and spending another minute in a rusty spur while the jukebox sat silent and dead was definitely one of them. My hand was on the door handle when the music started again. It was the same Johnny Cash song from earlier, Hurt, the cover version with the elderly, wavering vocals that sounded like grief made audible. The jukebox had restarted itself, which meant I consulted the rules again. It had to keep playing. If it stopped on its own, leave immediately. But if it started again, there was nothing in the rules about that. I stood frozen at the door, caught between the imperative to run and the equally strong imperative to stay, to finish the job, to not forfeit the money I so desperately needed. The choice was made for me when I tried the door handle and found it wouldn't turn. The lock that had opened so easily when I'd arrived was now jammed, refusing to budge no matter how hard I twisted or pulled. I was locked in, trapped with whatever walked upstairs, with whatever knocked in the cold storage, with the woman in blue at table 7 and all the other spirits that the mirror had shown me. The building had decided I wasn't leaving yet, not until it was ready to let me go. So I did the only thing I could do. I went back to work. I finished cleaning the bar, methodically wiping down every surface, polishing the brass foot rail, even though my hands shook and my breath came in shallow gasps. I cleaned because it was a task, something concrete and real to focus on, something that made sense in a place where nothing else did. By 4:30, I was done. The pub was as clean as it was going to get, and the door was still locked. I sat at one of the tables, not table 7, never table 7, and waited for 5 a.m., for the arbitrary deadline when Raymond's rules said I could leave. 15 minutes felt like hours. The jukebox played on, cycling through songs I'd heard multiple times already. The footsteps started again upstairs, that slow pacing back and forth. The cold storage door received 3 sharp knocks, then silence. At 4:58 a.m., I tried the door again. This time, it opened easily, swinging outward into the parking lot and the pre-dawn darkness. I practically fell through it, gulping in the warm, August air like I'd been drowning. Behind me, The pub sat quiet and still, the neon sign dark, the windows reflecting nothing but my own scared face. I got in my car and drove home with shaking hands, and I didn't look back once. But I knew, with sick certainty, that I would return. I needed the money, and something about the pub had gotten its hooks into me, a morbid curiosity that was stronger than common sense. The Rusty Spur wasn't done with me yet, and I wasn't done with it. I spent the entire next day researching the Rusty Spur, driven by a need to understand what I'd experienced. Sleep had been impossible after my first shift. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that woman in blue, felt that unnatural cold, heard that insistent knocking from behind the cold storage door. If I was going to return, and the reality of my bank account meant I had no choice, I needed to know what I was dealing with. The pub's official history was easy enough to find. It had been established in 1962 by a man named Earl Hastings, who'd run it successfully for nearly 2 decades before selling it to a couple from Austin in 1981. They'd kept it for 6 years before abruptly putting it back on the market. After that, the ownership became a revolving door. 7 different owners in the span of 15 years, none of them lasting more than 2 years. Raymond Kowalski was the most recent in this long line, having purchased the property in 2018. But it was the unofficial history that interested me more. I dove into local forums, historical society archives, and digitized newspaper collections, piecing together fragments of stories that painted a much darker picture than the pub's cheerful exterior suggested. The first incident I found dated back to 1976. A waitress named Rebecca Martinez had disappeared after her shift one October night. She'd been seen locking up the pub at 2 a.m. by a passing patrol officer, but her car was still in the parking lot when the morning shift arrived. Her purse, keys, and jacket were inside the vehicle, untouched. Rebecca herself was never found. The case remained open but unsolved, eventually going cold like so many missing persons cases do. That same year, according to a brief mention in the Lockhart Post-Register, Earl Hastings had closed the pub's second floor permanently, citing structural concerns. But a follow-up article 3 months later mentioned that inspectors found no evidence of structural damage. The second floor remained sealed anyway, and Earl refused to discuss his reasoning with reporters. In 1983, during the brief tenure of those Austin owners, a cook named James Pruitt died in the cold storage. The official cause of death was listed as hypothermia, which made sense for a walk-in freezer, except that the temperature inside was only 40 degrees. Uncomfortable, but not lethal. The door had been locked from the outside, and James had been inside for less than an hour when he was found. The medical examiner noted that his core body temperature was far lower than exposure to 40 degrees should have produced, as if he'd been submerged in ice water instead. No explanation was ever provided for this discrepancy. The pub's phone line was disconnected in 1987, right after a night manager reported receiving dozens of calls every night, all from the same number. When she tried calling it back, she reached a disconnected line. When the phone company investigated, they found that the number didn't exist in their system and never had. The manager quit the following week, and the new owner decided disconnecting the phone entirely was easier than dealing with the mystery. I found mentions of Table 7 in multiple sources. A blog post from 2012, written by a former bartender, described a regular customer who insisted on sitting there every night, always ordered whiskey neat, and never spoke to anyone. The bartender eventually realized that this customer never actually drank the whiskey. It would sit there, untouched, until closing time. One night, the bartender tried to engage her in conversation, asking her name, where she was from. The woman had smiled, and the bartender wrote that it was the coldest, emptiest expression I've ever seen on a human face. The bartender quit that night and never returned. A paranormal investigation team had visited in 2015, according to their website. They'd set up equipment throughout the pub, hoping to capture evidence of the reported activity. Their investigation lasted less than 2 hours. The final entry in their case file simply stated, "Location is extremely active. Recommend avoiding after dark. Will not return." They never published their findings or explained what had happened. But it was the oldest story that chilled me most. I found it in the collection of oral histories compiled by the Lockhart Historical Society in the 1990s. An elderly woman named Martha Hughes, who'd been a teenager in the early 1960s, recalled the land where the Rusty Spur now stood. Before Earl Hastings built his pub, the lot had been empty for decades, considered cursed by locals. In the 1920s, it had been the site of a speakeasy run by a woman named Iris Walton. During a police raid on December 15th, 1927, the speakeasy had caught fire. 7 people died in the blaze, including Iris herself. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves, and the lot remained vacant for 35 years before Earl decided to build his pub there. December 15th, 1927. I checked the calendar. My first shift had been on December 15th, 2024, exactly 97 years after the fire. Was that significant? Or just an eerie coincidence? Martha Hughes' interview contained one more detail that stuck with me. My grandmother always said you could hear music coming from that empty lot on winter nights, even though there was nothing there but weeds and scorched earth. She said the dead were still dancing, still drinking, still pretending they hadn't burned alive. I sat back from my laptop, processing everything I'd learned. The Rusty Spur wasn't just haunted. It was built on top of tragedy, constructed on a foundation of death and fear. The spirits I'd encountered weren't random. They had history, origin stories, reasons for lingering. Rebecca Martinez, who'd vanished without a trace. James Pruitt, who'd frozen to death in impossible conditions. Iris Walton, who'd burned along with her patrons 97 years ago. And how many others? How many deaths and disappearances have been forgotten, never recorded, lost to time? The rules made more sense now. They weren't arbitrary superstitions. They were hard-won wisdom, each one written in someone's blood or sanity. Never turn off the jukebox, because the music kept the dead distracted, gave them an echo of the life they'd lost. Don't look at the mirror between midnight and 3 a.m., because that's when the veil was thinnest, when the reflection showed not what was but what had been. Ignore the footsteps upstairs, because whatever was on that sealed second floor had been contained for a reason. And table 7, the woman in blue. I spent another hour searching for her identity, cross-referencing descriptions from various accounts. The blue dress, the dark hair, the empty smile. Finally, I found a photograph in a 1925 edition of the Lockhart Gazette. It was a society page announcement for a local businessman's engagement party, held at a certain unnamed establishment that everyone knew was Iris Walton's speakeasy. In the background of the photograph, barely visible, was a woman in a blue dress serving drinks. The caption didn't name her, but the image was clear enough. Pale skin, dark hair pinned in style of the era, and a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. This was my ghost, one of Iris Walton's employees, a nameless server who died in the fire and never left her post. How many thousands of drinks had she served in life? And how many more had she served in death? Going through the motions night after night, year after year, decade after decade, trapped in a routine that had long since lost all meaning. I called Raymond that evening, before my second shift. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice wary. Having second thoughts about the job? I need to know more about the pub's history, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The things I experienced last night, they're not normal. You know they're not normal. There was a long silence. Then, you follow the rules? Yes. And you're still willing to come back? I thought about my eviction notice, about the money he was paying me, about the morbid fascination that had taken root in my mind. Yes. Another pause. The pub has a past. A lot of places do. The difference is, the Rusty Spur remembers its past. It holds on to it. It won't let go. His voice dropped lower. I bought this place thinking I could change things, thinking new ownership and fresh paint would be enough. It wasn't. The best I can do is manage it. Keep it contained. Make sure people follow the rules so they stay safe. What happened to the previous owners? I asked. They left. They all left. Except for one. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. Look, I need someone who can handle this. Someone who won't crack. Who won't do something stupid like try to open the cold storage or answer the phone. Someone who can just clean and leave and not ask too many questions. Can you be that person? I should have said no. Any rational person would have said no. But rationality had left the building somewhere around the time I'd seen a woman flicker in and out of existence at table 7. I can try, I said. That's all I ask. Just follow the rules. Don't deviate. Don't experiment. Don't try to communicate with anything you might encounter. Clock in, clean, clock out. Routine is safe. Curiosity is dangerous. He hesitated, then added, and if you find anything unusual, documents, objects, anything that feels like it doesn't belong, don't touch it. Don't move it. Just let me know. Like what? You'll know it when you see it, he said, and hung up. That night, I returned to the Rusty Spur with a mixture of dread and determination. The pub looked the same as before, shabby, unwelcoming, squatting in the darkness like something that had grown there rather than been built. The jukebox was already playing when I entered, the same country standard cycling through. The smell was the same, stale beer, old cigarettes, and that underlying rot. But I was different. I wasn't walking into the unknown anymore. I knew the history, understood the context. These weren't random hauntings. They were echoes of specific tragedies, replaying their final moments over and over. That knowledge didn't make the experience less frightening, but it made it more comprehensible. I could work with comprehensible. I started my cleaning routine, following the same pattern as before. Tables first, then floors, then restrooms, then bar. I kept my eyes away from table 7 and the mirror behind the bar. I ignored the footsteps when they started upstairs around 1 a.m. I didn't flinch when the register opened itself and began printing another long receipt, which I checked and found to be another list of names, though mine wasn't on it this time. Around 2:30, while I was mopping near the back of the room, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small door, barely 4 feet tall, tucked into the corner behind a stack of empty beer kegs. It looked old, original to the building, with peeling paint and a brass knob tarnished black with age. It wasn't mentioned in the rules, which meant it was either safe or so dangerous that Raymond assumed no one would be stupid enough to try it. Raymond's warning echoed in my mind. If you find anything unusual, don't touch it. Don't move it. Just let me know. But curiosity, as he'd said, was dangerous, and I'd never been particularly good at following advice. I moved the beer kegs aside, quietly, glancing over my shoulder to make sure nothing was watching. The door's knob turned easily, surprisingly so, and the door swung inward to reveal a narrow set of stairs descending into darkness. The stairs descended steeply, the wood creaking under even the slightest weight. I pulled out my phone and activated the flashlight, pointing it down into the darkness. The beam didn't penetrate far. The basement, if that's what this was, seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. A draft rose from below, carrying with it that rot smell intensified tenfold, mixed with something else, smoke. Old smoke, the kind that had soaked into surfaces decades ago and never quite left. I should have closed the door, should have stacked the kegs back in place and pretended I'd never seen it. Instead, I found myself descending, one careful step at a time, the stairs groaning their protest with each footfall. The temperature dropped as I went deeper, and by the time I reached the bottom, I could see my breath misting in the air. The basement was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 15 feet square, with a dirt floor and stone walls that wept moisture. And it was full of things, tables and chairs, stacked haphazardly against one wall. A long wooden bar top, scarred and burned. Shelves of bottles, most empty or broken. And in the center of the space, a mannequin dressed in a blue evening gown from the 1920s. No, not a mannequin. The proportions were wrong. The way it stood was wrong. This was a figure, a representation, but it had been built with intention. Someone had dressed this carefully, positioned it deliberately, surrounded it with objects that had meaning. Candles, melted down to stubs. Photographs, too water damaged to make out faces. And scattered around its feet, handwritten notes on scraps of paper, dozens of them. I picked up one of the notes, holding my phone close to read the faded ink. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. Another. I didn't mean to leave you. I tried to come back. A third. Are you still here? Can you still hear me? These were messages to the dead. Apologies, pleas, confessions. This basement was a shrine, and the figure in blue was its focal point. Someone had been coming down here for years, maybe decades, try to communicate with the spirits that haunted the rusty spur, trying to appease them. I moved closer to the figure, and that's when I saw what it was holding. A photograph, clutched in articulated wooden fingers. I carefully lifted it free and angled my phone to see it clearly. The image was old, black and white, showing the interior of a speakeasy. The long bar I recognized. Pieces of it were scattered around this basement, salvaged from the fire. And standing behind that bar, serving drinks to a crowd of smiling patrons, was the woman I'd seen at table 7. Not a reproduction or an approximation. Her, exactly as she'd appeared to me, down to the way her hair was pinned, the cut of her dress, that empty smile. Written on the back of the photograph in shaky handwriting, Iris Walton's place, December 1927, the night before the fire. My hands began to shake. This photograph had been taken less than 24 hours before 7 people burned to death in this very spot. I was standing on their grave, surrounded by remnants of the place where they died. The rusty spur hadn't just been built on a site of tragedy. It had been built directly on top of it, incorporating the old foundation, the old bones, the old grief. A sound from behind me made me spin around. The woman in blue stood at the base of the stairs, perfectly solid, perfectly real. She wasn't flickering or translucent. She looked as substantial as I did, and she was staring at the photograph in my hands with an expression that was no longer empty. It was hungry. I didn't mean to. I started, but she moved with impossible speed, crossing the distance between us in less than a second. Her hand, cold, so cold it burned, gripped my wrist, and the basement disappeared. I was standing in the speakeasy, but it was alive now, full of people in 1920s attire drinking and laughing and dancing to jazz music from a gramophone. The woman in blue moved through the crowd serving drinks, and I realized I was seeing through her eyes, experiencing her memories. The warmth of the room, the smell of gin and perfume, the sound of conversation and music blending into a pleasant hum. This was her life, her world, the place where she'd existed. Then the door burst open. Men in uniform stormed in, shouting, and music stopped. Panic erupted. People ran for the exits, but there were too many trying to leave at once. Someone knocked over a candle. Someone else kicked over a space heater. Flames caught on the wooden floor, spread to the curtains, raced across the ceiling. I felt the heat, the smoke filling my lungs, the terror of being trapped. The woman in blue, I still didn't know her name, had tried to help people escape, had dragged unconscious patrons toward the door even as her own dress caught fire. She died slowly, painfully, burning alive while trying to save others. And she'd never understood why. Why the police had come that night. Why she'd been punished for simply doing her job. Why she'd died in agony when all she'd wanted was to earn a living and maybe have a little fun along the way. The vision released me, and I was back in the basement, gasping, tears streaming down my face. The woman in blue stood before me, no longer hungry, but sad. Infinitely, impossibly sad. She pointed to the photograph in my hand, then to herself, then up toward the pub above us. She was showing me, explaining, making me understand. You're trapped here, I whispered. You've been trapped here since the fire. You and the others. She nodded slowly. Then she pointed to the shrine, to all the notes scattered around, and made a gesture I interpreted as gathering or collecting. Someone had been trying to help them, trying to give them peace. But it hadn't worked. Whatever ritual or offering or prayer had been attempted, it hadn't been enough to free the spirits that haunted this place. Who built this? I asked, gesturing to the shrine. Who's been coming down here? She pointed upward again, more insistently this time, and I understood. Someone who worked at the pub. Someone who knew the truth. Maybe Raymond himself, or one of the previous owners, or... The basement door slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. The woman in blue vanished instantly, and I was alone in the darkness with my phone's dying flashlight. I ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time, and threw my weight against the door. It didn't budge. Locked. Trapped. Panic clawed at my throat. The air down here was thick and hard to breathe, and the smell of smoke was getting stronger, as if the fire for 1927 was still burning somewhere just out of sight. I pounded on the door, screaming for help even though I knew no one would hear me. The pub was empty. I was alone. No, not alone. Never alone in the rusty spur. I heard them before I saw them. Footsteps on the dirt floor behind me. Multiple sets, moving slowly. I turned, swinging my phone's light around the basement. They stood in a semicircle. 7 figures that hadn't been there moments before. Men and women in 1920s clothing, their faces blackened with soot, their clothes scorched and torn. The fire victims. All of them, including the woman in blue, who stood at their center looking at me with that terrible sadness. They weren't threatening. They weren't trying to harm me. They were just there, existing, waiting, hoping I might be the one who could finally set them free. I don't know how to help you, I said, my voice breaking. I don't know what you need. The woman in blue raised her hand and pointed at something behind me, near the stairs. I turned and saw what I'd missed before. Words carved into the stone wall, crude and deep, like someone had used a nail or a piece of metal to scratch them there. I moved closer, reading by the light of my phone. They sealed U.S. in. They watched U.S. burn. They never said our names. Below that, in different handwriting, more recent, I tried. I'm sorry. I failed. And below that, newest of all, the stone still pale where it had been carved. Remember U.S. Speak our names. Set U.S. free. I understood then. The shrine wasn't about apology or appeasement. It was about memory. These spirits were trapped because they'd been forgotten, buried in unmarked graves, never properly mourned or acknowledged. The police had covered up the raid and the fire, and history had erased 7 people who died terrified and in agony. They'd become ghost stories, urban legends, nameless haunts in a cursed building, and they'd been waiting nearly a century for someone to remember them as people. Tell me your names, I said to the assembled spirits. Please, I'll remember you. I'll make sure others remember too. The woman in blue stepped forward. She didn't speak. I don't think she could, but she placed her hand on my forehead, and I knew. Her name was Alice. Alice Brennan. She'd been 23 years old when she died, a waitress at Ayers Walton Speakeasy, sending money home to her family in Oklahoma. The others stepped forward in turn, each one sharing their name, their story, the lives they'd lived before the fire stole everything. Thomas Reed, the piano player. Margaret Santos, a regular patron who'd loved jazz. William Chun, a bartender who dreamed of opening his own legitimate club. Catherine Hart, only 19, who'd lied about her age to get into the speakeasy. James Riley, who'd been celebrating his engagement that night. Daniel Ortiz, who'd been hiding from a dangerous man and thought Iris's place was safe. And Iris Walton herself, the proprietor, who'd known the risks but thought she was providing something valuable. A place for people to forget their troubles, to have a little joy in difficult times. She'd died trying to unlock the back exit, trying to save her patrons, and she'd failed. 7 names, 7 lives, 7 deaths that had been deliberately forgotten. The door at the top of the stairs clicked open. The spirits faded like smoke, releasing me from their collective memory. I climbed the stairs on shaking legs and emerged into the pub's main room. The jukebox was playing Amazing Grace, which it definitely hadn't been playing before. I checked my phone. 4:47 a.m. I'd been in the basement for over 2 hours, though it had felt like minutes. I stacked the beer kegs back in front of the small door, hiding it again. Then I pulled out my notebook and wrote down everything I'd learned. 7 names, 7 stories, evidence that they'd existed, that they'd mattered, that their deaths hadn't been meaningless. When I finished cleaning and left at 5 a.m., I didn't feel the same terror as before. I felt purpose. I'd been given a task, a responsibility. The Rusty Spurs ghosts weren't malevolent. They were desperate, and maybe, just maybe, I could help them find peace. But first, I needed to understand more about the rules, because each one corresponded to a specific spirit, a specific tragedy. And if I was going to help them, I needed to know what I was really dealing with. I spent my day off becoming an amateur investigator, diving deeper into the archives and following threads of information that I'd previously overlooked. The 7 names from the Speakeasy fire were my starting point. But the Rusty Spurs haunting was more complex than a single tragedy. The pub had accumulated spirits over decades, each one tied to a specific rule, each rule a warning written in someone's suffering. I started with Rebecca Martinez, the waitress who'd vanished in 1976. Police reports were sparse, but I found her sister's contact information through social media. Maria Martinez was in her 70s now, living in San Antonio, and she was surprised but willing to talk when I explained I was researching the pub's history. Rebecca loved that job. Maria told me over the phone, her voice heavy with old grief. She was saving money for nursing school. She'd work until 2 or 3 in the morning, then come home and study. She was always so tired, but she never complained. Maria paused, and I heard her take a shaky breath. The night she disappeared, she called me around midnight. She was scared. She said things were moving on their own, that she kept hearing someone walking around upstairs, even though Mr. Hastings had sealed that floor years before. She said she felt like she was being watched. Did she mention anything specific? Any particular area of the pub? The cold storage, Maria said immediately. She said she kept hearing someone knocking on the door from inside, but every time she checked, it was empty and locked. She was terrified of that door. She told Mr. Hastings about it, but he just gave her a list of rules to follow. Her voice turned bitter, like rules could protect her from whatever took my sister. I thought about Rule 4. The cold storage door must remain locked. Do not open it, even if you hear knocking. Rebecca had heard the knocking. Had she followed the rule, or had her curiosity, or maybe her compassion, thinking someone was trapped, overridden her caution? Maria, did they ever find any evidence of what happened to her? Nothing. It's like she just evaporated. Her car was there, her purse, everything. But Rebecca was gone. She was quiet for a moment. You know what the worst part is? I still feel like she's there. Like she never left that pub. Like she's still trapped inside, knocking on that door, trying to get out. After I hung up, I sat staring at my notes. Rebecca hadn't just disappeared. She'd been absorbed somehow. The pub had taken her, and it was using her now, making her part of its haunting. The knocking I'd heard wasn't something trying to get into the cold storage. It was Rebecca, or what was left of her, trying to get out. I moved on to James Pruitt, the cook who'd frozen to death in 1983. This took more digging, but I eventually found his death certificate and the incident report filed by the Austin owners. The details were even stranger than I'd initially read. James had been locked in the cold storage for less than 45 minutes, in a space that was maintained at 40 degrees. When they found him, his body temperature was 68 degrees, far too low for the exposure time and temperature. But more disturbingly, the report noted that his body was completely dry. No perspiration, no condensation from his breath, nothing. It was as if all the moisture had been pulled from his tissues. The medical examiner had theorized rapid hypothermia combined with severe dehydration, but couldn't explain the mechanism. The investigator's notes, written in the margins of the report, were more telling. Something wrong with that storage unit. Temperature readings don't match observed conditions. Recommend sealing it permanently. But it hadn't been sealed. It was still there, still functional, still part of the pub's infrastructure, and still, apparently, capable of killing people through means that defied logical explanation. I found a brief obituary for James Pruitt. He'd been 28, recently married, working 2 jobs to save for a house. He'd taken a night shift at the Rusty Spur because it paid better. One bad decision, one moment of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he died in terror and agony. Now he was part of the haunting too, another spirit trapped by the building's malevolent hunger. The phone was next. I tracked down articles about the disconnection in 1987 and found the name of the night manager who'd reported the phantom calls, Gloria Reeves. She was harder to find than Maria Martinez, but I eventually located her through a combination of public records and persistence. She lived in Houston now, and when I called, she was immediately suspicious. "I don't talk about that place," she said flatly. "I spent 10 years trying to forget everything that happened there." "Please," I said. "I'm working there now, and I need to understand." "You're working there?" Her voice rose in pitch. "At night? Alone?" "Yes." "Then you're already in danger. The best thing you can do is quit. Tonight. Don't go back." "I can't. I need the money. And besides," I hesitated, unsure how to explain. "I think I can help them. The spirits. I think they're trapped, and maybe—" "You can't help them," Gloria interrupted. "They're beyond help. That place doesn't trap spirits. It creates them. It feeds on fear and suffering, and it's been doing it for decades, maybe longer." She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was calmer but heavy with remembered dread. "The phone call started 3 months after I began working there. Always the same number, even though the number didn't exist. I'd answer. This was before I learned not to, and I'd hear breathing, just breathing. Sometimes a voice would whisper things, names of people who died in the pub, dates of deaths I couldn't have known about, secrets about the previous owners." "What kind of secrets?" "The kind that explained why they all left so quickly. The kind that made me understand this wasn't just a haunted building. It was a cursed one." She paused. One night, the phone rang, and I answered without thinking. The voice on the other end was mine. My own voice, telling me what would happen if I stayed, describing my death in detail. I hung up, but the phone kept ringing, and every time I didn't answer, it got worse. Objects would move. The temperature would drop. I'd hear footsteps following me. So I'd answer, and my own voice would describe another way I might die. It was showing me possibilities, threatening me. "What did you do?" I had the phone line disconnected. I thought that would stop it. It didn't. The phone kept ringing anyway, even with no line connected. That's when I quit. That's when I got as far from Lockhart as I could and never looked back. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But here's what you need to understand. The phone isn't calling from somewhere else. It's calling from inside the pub, from the past, from all the moments of death and terror that have happened in that building. It's the pub itself trying to communicate, and you should never, ever answer it. Because once you engage with it, once you acknowledge it, it gets stronger. It gets hungrier." Rule 5. If the telephone rings, do not answer. It hasn't been connected to a line since 1987. I understood now. The phone wasn't disconnected to prevent incoming calls. It was disconnected to prevent outgoing ones, to prevent the pub from reaching out, from extending its influence beyond its physical walls. As long as the phone rang unanswered, the haunting remained contained. But if someone answered, if someone engaged with that malevolent intelligence, the boundaries would weaken. Gloria, do you know who sealed the second floor? And why? Earl Hastings did in 1976, right after Rebecca Martinez disappeared. He never said why publicly, but my predecessor told me something Earl had confided to him. He said there was someone living up there, someone who shouldn't have been living at all, someone who died in the original speakeasy fire and never left. And over the years, she'd become wrong, twisted by decades of isolation and rage. Earl went up there one night to confront her, and what he saw terrified him so much that he sealed the entire floor the next day. Had the stairwell bricked up, the windows boarded over, everything. He paid for it out of his own pocket and refused to explain himself to anyone. Who was she? He never said a name, but he told my predecessor. She was beautiful once, I'm sure. But 50 years of burning will change anyone. Gloria's voice wavered. I think it was Iris Walton. I think she's still up there, still trapped, still burning. I felt sick. Iris Walton, the speakeasy's proprietor, who died trying to save her patrons. She hadn't moved on like the others. She'd lingered, and the isolation and trauma had corrupted her spirit into something monstrous. The footsteps I heard pacing back and forth weren't random. They were Iris, walking the same pattern she'd walked on the night of the fire, trying to find a way to save everyone, failing over and over for eternity. Rule 3. If you hear footsteps upstairs, ignore them. The second floor has been sealed for 20 years. Not just sealed, deliberately isolated, quarantined, because whatever Iris had become, she was too dangerous to confront, too powerful to banish. The only option was containment, keeping her locked away and hoping she'd eventually fade. But she hadn't faded. She'd only grown stronger, angrier, more desperate. I spent the rest of the day compiling everything I'd learned, creating a comprehensive map of the Rusty Spur's haunting. Each rule corresponded to a specific spirit or phenomenon. Rule 1. The jukebox kept the speakeasy victims present and calm. Music had been their joy in life. It was their anchor in death. Rule 2. The mirror showed the pub's true nature between midnight and 3 a.m., the hours when the veil was thinnest and the dead were most visible. Rule 3. The footsteps were Iris Walton's endless patrol, and acknowledging them would draw her attention, possibly allowing her to break through the seal. Rule 4. The cold storage contained Rebecca Martinez and possibly James Pruitt, spirits so damaged by their deaths that they'd become dangerous. Rule 5. The telephone was the pub's voice, its consciousness, trying to extend its reach and claim new victims. Rule 6. The kitchen must have its own tragedy, something that happened after midnight that made the space too dangerous to enter. Rule 7. The woman in blue was Alice Brennan, who appeared at table 7 every night, still serving invisible customers, still trapped in a routine of her final evening. Rule 8. The curtains likely prevented the spirits from seeing outside, from remembering the world they'd lost, and becoming agitated. Rule 9. The lights must give something time to adjust or retreat if the power failed, preventing a direct confrontation in complete darkness. Rule 10. Leaving before 5 a.m. probably coincided with the moment when the haunting was strongest, when whatever intelligence controlled the pub was most active and most dangerous. Each rule was a survival strategy developed through trial and error, written in the fear and suffering of everyone who'd worked at the Rusty Spur before me. Raymond hadn't created these rules. He'd inherited them, collected them, refined them based on decades of experience. They weren't meant to solve the problem. They were meant to manage it. But management wasn't enough. Not anymore. The spirits were suffering, trapped in loops of trauma and pain. Rebecca Martinez was still trying to escape the cold storage. James Pruitt was still freezing. The speakeasy victims were still watching their friends burn. Iris Walton was still failing to save everyone. And the pub itself was feeding on all that anguish, growing stronger, claiming more victims. I had to do more than just follow the rules. I had to break the cycle. But how? The answer came from an unlikely source: the shrine in the basement. Someone had tried to help before. Someone had gathered names, left offerings, attempted some kind of ritual to free the spirits. They'd failed, but they'd been on the right track. The speakeasy victims had shown me what they needed: to be remembered, to be acknowledged, to have their names spoken and their lives honored. Maybe that was the key. Not exorcism or banishment, but recognition. Giving each spirit what they needed to finally let go. Remembrance for the forgotten, rescue for the trapped, justice for the wronged, peace for the suffering. It was a long shot. It was probably impossible, but I had to try. Because the alternative, leaving them trapped forever, or worse, becoming one of them, was unbearable. That night, when I returned to the Rusty Spur, I brought something I'd never brought before: hope. The pub looked different when I arrived for my third shift. Or maybe I looked at it differently, now that I understood what it really was: not a haunted building, but a prison. A cage constructed of brick and wood and years of accumulated suffering, holding too many souls in an endless cycle of death and despair. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, and in its unstable light, I could almost see faces in the window, pale and watching. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The jukebox was playing "I Fall to Pieces," Patsy Cline's voice filling the empty space with melancholy. The smell was stronger tonight: rot and smoke, and something underneath it all that might have been fear itself, given physical form. I set down my cleaning supplies and pulled out the list of names I compiled: 7 from the speakeasy fire, plus Rebecca Martinez and James Pruitt, and who knew how many others. "I know you're here," I said to the empty room, feeling foolish but determined. "I know your names now. I know what happened to you, and I want to help." The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The jukebox skipped, jumped to a different song, Amazing Grace again, the same song that had played when I'd emerged from the basement. Around me, the air began to shimmer, and figures materialized like photographs developing in reverse. The speakeasy victims stood in a loose circle, Alice Brennan at their center. But there were more now: a young man in Cook's whites who had to be James Pruitt, and a woman in a waitress uniform from the 70s with Rebecca Martinez's face from the old newspaper photos. They were all watching me with expressions that ranged from hope to hunger to something that might have been warning. "I don't have all the answers," I admitted. "I don't know the right ritual or the proper words. But I know you've been forgotten, and that's not right. So I'm going to remember you. All of you. I'm going to say your names and tell your stories. And I'm going to make sure others know what happened here." I started with the speakeasy victims, reading from my notes. Alice Brennan, waitress, died at 23 trying to help others escape. Thomas Reed, piano player, who'd brought joy through his music. Margaret Santos, Catherine Hart, William Chun, James Riley, Daniel Ortiz. Each name spoken clearly, each life acknowledged. And Iris Walton, who'd created a place for people to find happiness in hard times and died trying to protect them. As I spoke each name, something changed. The spirits became more solid, more present, but also calmer. The desperate hunger in their expressions faded, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. Recognition was a kind of sustenance, a validation that their existence had mattered. When I finished with the speakeasy victims, I moved on to Rebecca Martinez. I told her story, how she'd been working to save money for nursing school, how she called her sister scared and desperate, how she'd never made it home. "Your sister Maria still thinks about you," I said. "She never forgot you, and now I won't either." Rebecca's spirit moved closer, and I saw tears on her translucent face. She pointed toward the cold storage door, and I understood what she was asking. She wanted to be released. She wanted to stop knocking, stop trying to escape a trap she'd been caught in for 48 years. I don't know if I can open that door, I said honestly. The rules say. Rebecca shook her head and pointed at me. Then at the door, they made a gesture like breaking something. She wasn't asking me to open it. She was asking me to break the seal, to destroy whatever was keeping her trapped there. Before I could respond, the temperature plummeted further, and a new presence filled the room. The footsteps started upstairs, but louder than I'd ever heard them, thunderous and angry. The spirits around me backed away, fear written on their faces. Even Alice, who'd shown me her memories and trusted me with her name, retreated to the relative safety of table 7. Iris, I called toward the ceiling. Iris Walton, I know you're up there. I know what happened to you. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was silent except for the jukebox, which had gone back to playing Patsy Cline. Then a voice, hoarse from decades of disuse, spoke from somewhere above me. Oh, nothing. I know you died trying to save people. I continued, keeping my voice steady despite the terror crawling up my spine. I know you've been trapped here for 97 years, reliving the worst night of your life over and over. I know you're suffering. A crash from upstairs, like furniture being hurled against walls. Suffering is all. It doesn't have to be. The others, the people who died with you, they're here. They're waiting. They want to help you move on. Liars. The word was a shriek that made the glasses behind the bar rattle. They left me. They moved on. I burned. I finally understood. The other speakeasy victims had managed some form of peace, even if it was just the routine of haunting table 7 or serving invisible drinks. But Iris had been the proprietor, the one responsible, the one who'd failed to save everyone. Her guilt had anchored her more firmly than any of the others, and isolation had twisted that guilt into rage. She blamed herself, but she also blamed them for leaving her behind. They didn't leave you, I said. They've been here the whole time. They've been waiting for you to forgive yourself, to let them forgive you. Another crash, then silence. When Iris spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost plaintive. I tried to save them. I know. And some of them are here because you succeeded, because you gave them those extra seconds they needed to get out. You didn't fail, Iris. You did everything you could. The ceiling groaned, and dust rained down. I looked up and saw a crack forming in the plaster, spreading like a lightning bolt across the surface. The seal Earl Hastings had created was breaking. Iris was coming down. The spirits around me began to move, forming a tighter circle, and I realized they weren't just watching anymore. They were preparing. Alice Brennan held out her hand to me, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it. Her fingers were cold but solid, and through that contact, I felt what she felt. Not fear, but determination. They'd been waiting for someone to speak their names, but they'd also been waiting for someone to confront Iris, to bring her back to them. The ceiling split open, and Iris Walton descended through the gap like a falling star. She was beautiful and terrible, dressed in a charred evening gown, her skin cracked and blackened like burned paper, her eyes glowing with decades of fury and pain. She touched down in the center of the room, and where her feet met the floor, scorch marks appeared. You speak of forgiveness, she said, her voice no longer hoarse but clear and resonant. But you know nothing of what I've endured. You're right, I admitted. I can't imagine what you've been through, but I know they can. I gestured to the spirits around me. They burned too. They died too. And they've been here, watching you suffer, unable to reach you because you sealed yourself off. You locked yourself in your own guilt. Iris looked at the spirits for the first time in decades, really looked at them, and I saw something crack in her expression. Alice, she whispered, focusing on the woman in blue. You stayed. Alice nodded and spoke, her voice faint but clear. We all stayed. We were waiting for you to come back to us. But I failed. You gave me 30 more seconds, Thomas Reed said, stepping forward. Those 30 seconds let me help Margaret out the window. We lived 30 seconds longer because of you. You unlocked the back door, William chatted. 3 of us made it out before the smoke got too thick. We survived because of you. You didn't fail us, Alice said firmly. We failed you. We moved on in our own ways, found our own small pieces, and we left you alone with your grief. That was wrong. We should have found a way to reach you sooner. Iris was crying now, tears that evaporated into steam as they ran down her burned face. I'm so tired. Then rest, Alice said, and she opened her arms. One by one, the other speakeasy victims moved forward, surrounding Iris, embracing her despite the heat that radiated from her charred form. And as they held her, something remarkable happened. The burns began to fade. The cracks sealed. The glow dimmed. Iris Walton was being restored, not to life, but to the state she'd been in before decades of isolation had corrupted her spirit. When they separated, Iris looked like a woman again, not a monster. She wore a simple dress from the 1920s, and her skin was smooth and whole. She looked at me with eyes that were tired but sane. Thank you, she said, her voice normal now, almost musical. Thank you for bringing them back to me. I didn't do anything, I said. I just spoke your names. Sometimes, Iris replied. That's enough. The speakeasy victims began to fade, not disappearing, but becoming less substantial, like they were finally able to move beyond the veil that had trapped them. Before she vanished completely, Alice looked at me and mouthed 2 words. The others. Right. Rebecca and James were still here, still trapped. Iris had been the largest, most powerful spirit, but they had their own prisons to escape. I approached the cold storage door, Rebecca's spirit following me. How do I help you? I asked her. She pointed at the lock, then made that breaking gesture again. She needed the physical seal destroyed, the mechanism that had trapped her dissolved. I thought about the rules. Don't open the cold storage, even if you hear knocking. But rules were made to contain problems, not solve them. If I wanted to free Rebecca, I had to break this particular rule. I grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and used it as a battering ram, slamming it into the cold storage door's lock again and again. The metal shrieked and bent, and finally, with a crack like breaking ice, the lock shattered. The door swung open on its own, pushed by some invisible force from within. Rebecca's spirit rushed forward into the cold storage, and for a moment, I saw her as she'd been on the night she disappeared. Young, frightened, trapped behind a door that wouldn't open no matter how hard she pounded. Then the image shifted, and I saw what had really happened. She hadn't been pulled into the cold storage by some external force. She'd opened it herself, hearing the knocking, thinking someone was trapped inside. And when she'd crossed the threshold, something had seized her, not a spirit, but the building itself. The rusty spur had been hungry, and Rebecca had been willing prey. But now, with the lock broken and the seal destroyed, the trap had lost its power. Rebecca walked back out of the cold storage, and she was smiling. Really smiling. Not the empty reflex I'd seen on Alice's face, but genuine relief and joy. She mouthed, "Thank you," and then she was gone, fading in a light that looked almost like sunrise. James Pruitt's spirit stood near the cold storage, watching. He looked younger than his death certificate photo, more hopeful. He didn't need the same release Rebecca had needed. He died in there, but he wasn't bound to it the same way. What he needed was simpler, acknowledgement that his death hadn't been his fault, that he'd been a victim of forces beyond his control. "James Pruitt," I said clearly, "you died trying to earn money for your future. You were 28 years old. You had a wife who loved you. Your death wasn't an accident, and it wasn't your fault. You were murdered by this building's hunger, I'm sorry no one said that before now. He nodded once, and the tension in his form released. He looked toward the cold storage one last time, then back at me. Tell Sarah I never stopped loving her, he said, his voice a whisper that I felt more than heard. Tell her it's okay to move on. I will, I promised, though I had no idea if I'd be able to find his widow or if she was even still alive. But I'd try. That was all I could do. James faded more slowly than the others, like he was reluctant to leave, but eventually he was gone too. The cold storage stood open, its interior now just an ordinary refrigerated space. Nothing supernatural or threatening about it. The trap had been broken. I checked the time. 3:47 a.m. I still had over an hour before I was supposed to leave, but the pub felt different now. Lighter, less oppressive. The smell of rot had faded significantly, replaced by just the normal mustiness of an old building. The temperature had stabilized. Even the jukebox seemed to be playing at a more reasonable volume. But I wasn't done yet. The phone sat at the end of the bar, silent but waiting. I'd learned from Gloria Reeves that it was the pub's voice, its consciousness trying to reach out. And I'd been told repeatedly never to answer it. But maybe like the cold storage door, that rule needed to be broken. Maybe the pub itself needed to be heard, understood, and released from whatever compulsion drove it to trap and torment spirits. As if in response to my thoughts, the phone began to ring. The sound was jarring in the newfound quiet, that mechanical jangle cutting through the jukebox's soft country melody. I stared at it, watching it ring once, twice, 3 times. Every instinct screamed at me to follow the rules, to let it ring unanswered, to maintain the boundary between myself and whatever intelligence was on the other end. But boundaries had trapped the spirits here. Boundaries had kept them suffering. Maybe it was time to break down one more wall. I picked up the receiver. Static at first, thick and crackling like a damaged recording. Then, underneath it, breathing. And underneath that, voices. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all speaking at once, overlapping and blending into a cacophony of sound that should have been incomprehensible, but somehow wasn't. I could understand all of them simultaneously, each voice telling its story, sharing its death, expressing its pain. And I realized this wasn't the pub's consciousness. This was everyone. Every person who died here, or disappeared here, or suffered here over the decades. The phone wasn't calling out. It was calling in, drawing together all the trapped voices into one endless, desperate attempt at communication. I hear you, I said into the receiver. I hear all of you. The static shifted, coalesced, became a single voice that was somehow all the voices at once. Free us. I'm trying, I said. I freed the speakeasy victims. I freed Rebecca and James. But there are more of you, aren't there? People I don't know about. People whose names were never recorded. So many forgotten. Then tell me your names. I'll remember them. I'll make sure you're not forgotten anymore. What followed was a litany of the dead. Names and dates and brief flashes of how they died. A busboy in 1968 who'd fallen down the basement stairs and broken his neck. A customer in 1973 who'd choked and died before anyone could help. A maintenance worker in 1991 who'd been electrocuted by faulty wiring. Dozens of people who'd died ordinary deaths in an unordinary place, and whose spirits had been trapped by the building's insatiable hunger for suffering. I wrote down every name I could catch, filling page after page of my notebook with a record of the forgotten. Some deaths were accidents, genuine tragedies with no malice behind them, but others were different. Others had been caused by the building itself, or by whatever force had taken root here after the speakeasy fire. The rusty spur hadn't started out cursed. It had become cursed, transformed by accumulated trauma into something that actively sought more death, more suffering, more spirits to trap and torment. What? I asked the voices on the phone. Why does this place do this? It feeds on grief, grows stronger with each death. Was ordinary once, but blood and fire Change made it hungry, made it alive. The speakeasy fire had been the catalyst. 7 people burning to death in agony, their suffering soaking into the ground, into the foundation that would eventually support the rusty spur. The pub had been built on top of that trauma, and it had absorbed it, been transformed by it. Over the decades, each new death had made it stronger, more conscious, more deliberately malevolent. How do I stop it? I asked. How do I free all of you? Silence. Then acknowledge. Remember. Speak the names. But also, break the foundation, where it all began. Destroy the source, the basement, the shrine, the remnants of the original speakeasy that still existed beneath the pub's floor. That's where the curse had taken root, and that's where it would have to be ended. I hung up the phone gently, reverently, and it didn't ring again. The voices had said what they needed to say. Now it was up to me to act. I went to the back corner and moved the beer kegs aside, revealing the small door to the basement. It opened easily this time, welcoming me. I descended the stairs with my phone's flashlight, and when I reached the bottom, I saw that the basement had changed. The shrine was still there, but it looked smaller, less significant. The figure in the blue dress had fallen over, its carefully arranged pose destroyed, and the walls, the stone walls that wept moisture, were covered in names now, hundreds of them, carved and scratched, and written in substances I didn't want to identify. This was the pub's memory. Every person who died here, recorded in stone. Some names I recognized from my research. Most I didn't. But they were all here, all preserved, all trapped. I pulled out my notebook and began reading aloud, speaking every name I'd written down from the phone conversation. As I spoke, the names on the walls began to glow faintly, each one lighting up as it was acknowledged. And with each name, I felt the building shudder, felt its grip on those spirits weaken. When I finished with my list, I started on the walls themselves, reading every name I could see, even when the handwriting was illegible or the names were in languages I didn't speak. I read for what felt like hours, my voice growing hoarse, but I didn't stop. These people deserved to be remembered. They deserved to have their names spoken one last time. Finally, when every visible name had been read, I addressed the building itself. You were built on tragedy, but you don't have to perpetuate it. You've held on to these spirits for long enough. Let them go. Let them all go. Release them. The basement began to shake. Dust rained from the ceiling, and cracks appeared in the stone walls. The names were fading now, disappearing as the spirits they represented were finally freed. I could feel them leaving, sense them moving on to wherever spirits go when they're no longer bound to the physical world. But the building wasn't done fighting. It had fed on suffering for decades, had grown conscious and powerful through accumulated death. It didn't want to release its hold. It wanted to survive, even if survival meant continuing to trap and torment. The ceiling split, and debris began falling. I ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time as the basement collapsed behind me. I emerged into the main room just as the entire pub began to shake, a deep rumbling that sounded like the building was screaming. Pictures fell from walls. Glasses shattered behind the bar. The jukebox sparked and died, finally silenced after decades of continuous operation. I ran for the door, but it was locked again, the building making one last desperate attempt to claim me. I grabbed a chair and hurled it through the front window, climbing through the shattered glass as the rumbling intensified. I hit the parking lot gravel hard, rolling away from the building, and then I turned to watch. The rusty spur was tearing itself apart, not collapsing exactly, but breaking open like something was forcing its way out from the inside. And in the pre-dawn darkness, I saw them, spirits, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, streaming out through the broken window, through cracks in the walls, through the roof itself. They looked like smoke or mist at first, but as they rose into the sky, they became more defined, more human. I saw Alice Brennan and Iris Walton leading the speakeasy victims. I saw Rebecca Martinez and James Pruitt. I saw faces I didn't recognize, people from different eras, all of them finally free. They rose into the sky like a flock of birds taking flight, and then they were gone, dissolved into the morning air. The rumbling stopped. The shaking ceased. The rusty spur stood silent and still, looking somehow smaller than before, diminished. I sat on the gravel, bleeding from minor cuts, exhausted beyond measure, and watched the sun rise. I never stayed to watch dawn from inside the pub. Rule 10 had warned against it. Now I understood why. 5 a.m. was when the building's power was weakest, when the spirits could potentially escape if the bonds were broken. Raymond's rules have been designed to prevent exactly what I'd just done. My phone buzzed. A text from Raymond. "Are you okay?" Something happened. I felt it. I called him back, and he answered immediately. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. "I freed them," I said simply. "All of them. The pub isn't haunted anymore." Silence. Then, that's impossible. I've been trying for 6 years to find a way to help them, and I never could. The priest I brought in ran screaming. The paranormal investigators refused to go back. The medium I consulted said the place was beyond saving. "How did you do it?" "I listened to them," I said. "I learned their names. I acknowledged their suffering, and I broke the rules when the rules were the problem." Another long pause. The building, still standing, but it's different now. Emptier. "I think the curse is broken. I'll come check it out tomorrow," Raymond said. "Today. Whatever. After I've processed this." He hesitated. "Thank you. I know I hired you clean, not to, but thank you." I hung up and sat there for a while longer, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The rusty spur cast a long shadow across the parking lot, but it was just a shadow now. Just an old building with a dark history, nothing more. Eventually, I got in my car and drove home. I slept for 14 hours straight, dreamless and deep, the sleep of someone who'd spent 3 nights walking through other people's nightmares and finally found her way out. When I woke up, I wrote down everything that had happened. Every detail, every name, every encounter. I compiled it into a document that I plan to share with the Lockhart Historical Society, ensuring that the victims of the Rusty Spur would be remembered properly, their deaths acknowledged, and their lives honored. Raymond called 2 days later. "The pub is clean," he said, and I could hear the wonder in his voice. Not clean like you cleaned it, but clean like empty, peaceful. The jukebox doesn't turn itself on anymore. The phone doesn't ring. The footsteps have stopped. It's just a building now. What are you going to do with it? I don't know. Part of me wants to tear it down, salt the earth, make sure nothing like this ever happens again. But another part thinks maybe it deserves to be something better now. Something that brings joy instead of suffering. Maybe a community center or a music venue for local bands. Something that honors all the people who died there by being a place of life instead of death. "I think they'd like that," I said. "One more thing," Raymond added. I went down to the basement. The shrine is gone, just rubble now. But I found something in the debris. A journal. I think it belonged to Earl Hastings. He'd been documenting everything that happened in the pub since he opened it, trying to understand it, trying to find a way to help the spirits. He was the one who built the shrine. He was the one who tried all those rituals. He spent 30 years trying to free them and never succeeded. At the end, he wrote that he was sorry he'd failed them, sorry he'd built on cursed ground without understanding what he was unleashing. "He didn't fail," I said. "He laid the groundwork. He documented everything, created the rules that kept people safe, built the shrine that kept the victims together. He did what he could with what he knew. I just finished what he started." "Maybe," Raymond said, "or maybe you succeeded because you weren't carrying his guilt. You came in fresh, without preconceptions, and you saw what needed to be done. Either way, the spirits are free now, and that's what matters." We talked for a while longer, and by the end of the conversation, we'd agreed that I'd help him research the pub's history more thoroughly, compiling a complete record of everyone who died there or disappeared. It would take time, but I had time now. I didn't need the cleaning job anymore. Raymond had paid me a substantial bonus, enough to cover several months of rent, for services above and beyond standard cleaning duties. I never went back inside the rusty spur. Raymond sent me photos and videos as he cleaned out the building, preparing it for whatever its next incarnation would be. The interior looked ordinary now, just an old bar that needed updating. No shadows that moved on their own, no cold spots, no lingering sense of being watched. Just dust and old furniture and the ghosts of memories that were fading with each passing day. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about the spirits I met. I wonder where they are now, if they've found peace, if they've moved on to whatever comes after death. I like to imagine Alice Brennan serving drinks in some celestial speakeasy, her smile genuine now. I picture Iris Walton finally resting, her guilt absolved and her sacrifice acknowledged. I see Rebecca Martinez pursuing that nursing degree and whatever comes next, and James Pruitt building the house with his wife, both of them young and in love forever. The experience changed me. I learned that some places hold on to their past, but that doesn't mean they have to be defined by it. I learned that speaking someone's name, acknowledging their existence, remembering their story, that's not just kindness. Sometimes it's salvation. I learned that rules are important, but knowing when to break them is even more important. And I learned that the most terrifying places aren't always the ones with monsters lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they're the ones where people have suffered and been forgotten, where trauma has calcified into malevolence, where the dead can't rest because no one alive remembers they ever existed. The Rusty Spur taught me all of that in 3 nights of terror and wonder. It was the hardest job I've ever had, and the most important, because at the end of those 3 nights, dozens of souls who'd been trapped in torment found freedom. And that's worth any amount of fear, any number of sleepless nights haunted by memories of cold storage doors and ringing telephones and footsteps on sealed floors. Sometimes I drive past the lot where the Rusty Spur used to stand. Raymond eventually decided to tear it down after all, unable to shake the feeling that rebuilding on that foundation would be tempting fate. The land sits empty now, just grass and gravel where the pub once loomed. But it's different than it was before. Before, the emptiness felt heavy, oppressive, like the land itself was holding its breath. Now it feels light, open, ready for whatever comes next. Maybe someday someone will build something new there. Maybe it'll be a park or a restaurant or apartments. Whatever it becomes, I hope it's filled with laughter and life. I hope people gather there and make happy memories. I hope it becomes a place of joy, erasing the decades of sorrow that's soaked into that ground. Because that's the real ending to the story of the Rusty Spur. Not that it was haunted, but that it was healed. Not that spirits trapped people there, but that people freed those spirits. Not that darkness won, but that light, even the faint light of dawn after the longest night, eventually prevails. I work a normal job now, regular hours, nothing supernatural. But I still have the list of names from that phone call, and I still remember every spirit I encountered. I visit the cemetery sometimes, placing flowers on the graves of those who have them, acknowledging the existence of those who don't. It's a small thing, but it matters. Because in the end, being remembered, really, truly remembered, that's what saves us all from fading into nothing. That's what keeps us human, even in death. That's what transforms a curse into a blessing, a haunted place into a story with a happy ending. The Rusty Spur is gone now, demolished and buried, and remembered only by those of us who knew its secrets. But the people who haunted it, they're not gone. They're just somewhere else, somewhere better. And that makes every terrifying moment worth it. That makes it all worthwhile. The end.